There's something with
Yes.
I'm sorry. My internet just locked me out.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear
me? Yeah. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, we can.
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Please comment.
I can hear you.
Comment in the chat box.
So good morning, everybody. Jumping right into it. Today I'll be speaking on understanding the legal and regulatory environment for small and growing businesses. Our focus areas today, and if you could help move slides so everybody can look at that. We'll be talking about the structures for setting up a business, permits and licensing, taxation and incentives. We'll be talking about intellectual property, governance and compliance, contracts, and raising capital. So it's quite a lot to cover during this time period. I mean, these types of sessions, I actually prefer to do them physically. But I will try not to. If we could all mute, please, that'd be great. Everybody from the session. Good. So I'll try not to overload you with information while passing across the essentials and not to bore you. To incentivize everyone, I'll be asking random questions, 5 to 6 random questions over the course of the session. Anybody who gets up to 25 points. So the first person to answer in the chat gets 5 points, next person 3 points, third person 1 point. So first 3 people get points. First person to get to, should we say 20 or 25? First person to get to 20 gets free legal services. And as a lawyer, I will cap it, not free legal services in general. So we won't do a full capital raise for you for free. We can do a discount on it if you're the first person, but simple legal services of a certain category, like reviewing your contracts or incorporating a company, will be the price for for the person who is the first to get to 20. So let's start. So legal structures for businesses. Basically, and if you'd move to the other slide, I think it encapsulates it better. No, the next one. So basically, we have 4. Go back. We have 4 types of legal entities. We have the sole proprietorship. We have partnership. We have companies, and we have incorporated trustees. Right? Yes, that's the slide, please. Those are the 4 types of companies. Now, under a partnership, we then have 3 different types of partnerships. Under companies, we have 2 companies, and then so we have limited liability and unlimited liability companies, and then we have 3 types of limited liability companies. So today we'll be talking about the sole proprietorship, partnership, and the private limited liability company. If you help me move to the next slide. For the sole proprietorship, I think everybody, generally, from what I understand about the background of everybody here, everybody has at least a basic knowledge of business, has started business in one way or the other. So a sole proprietorship is really just me, myself, and I. It doesn't preclude you from having employees. It just means that you have a sole ownership of the business. And it's an unincorporated business, because you can actually have sole ownership of a company now, but it's incorporated. So sole ownership, unincorporated. It's important to note that even though it's unincorporated, there's a registration requirement in quotes. So you are not required to register a sole proprietorship as a company, but you are required to register your business name or register with your trade association. A lot of sole proprietorships don't do that, and it's important to do that, even for protection of your business as you're going forward. Ownership is the minimum and a maximum of 1. It has unlimited liability, so no separate legal personality, and the owner is liable for the debts and all the liability of the company. From a tax perspective, income is taxed in the hands of the owner or the proprietor. So it's efficient from a taxation perspective. It's, however, not ideal for raising finance. So the question will be, why am I talking about it? In what circumstances would a sole proprietorship then be ideal? Sole proprietorship can actually work for a very, very early growth stage company. So a business that has been started, you're trying to test the ground, prepare your prototype, and fill your way. It can start as a sole proprietorship. In that circumstance, also, it's ideal for businesses that have low risk. So if you're a very early stage company, but the risk is high, then don't do a sole proprietorship. Don't start as a sole proprietorship. Just go straight into setting up as a limited liability company. But if the risk is low, risk profile is low, you're not ready to start raising capital, and you're still just getting, the prototype, getting the business plan together, you can start as a sole proprietorship and register that business name. The question then will be, why bother to start as a sole proprietorship? Why don't I just say I'm doing my thing, and when I'm ready, I start up as a company? You can start as a sole proprietorship, register as a business name, and then convert that sole proprietorship into a company. So there's a regime now under CAMA where you can apply to convert a sole proprietorship registered as a business name into a limited liability company. So it gives you a jump start, so to speak, without the commitment at a stage where you're not quite ready to make that commitment. So that's the instance in which a sole proprietorship can work. Moving into a partnership. So partnerships, like I said, there are 3 different types of partnership. You can have a general partnership, a limited partnership, or a limited liability partnership. For a general partnership, liability is unlimited. So it's basically 2 people coming together by contract and saying that we want to start a business together, 2 or more. So it could be up to 20. We want to start a business together. We sign a contract that determines how we run our business. And of course, advisable, recommended, make sure you register it as a business name as well, and register with your trade association. Similar to sole proprietorship, the only difference is that you have 2 or more people. Tax, again, is taxed in the hands of partners as opposed to in the hands of the entity itself. It could be, so a general partnership, again, like a sole proprietorship, is not necessarily ideal for raising capital. It could be used for raising certain types of capital like debt. So you're getting a loan from the bank. If it's a registered general partnership, then you can get debt from the bank. But other than that, it's not ideal. A general partnership is not ideal for raising capital. A limited partnership and a limited liability partnership, on the other hand, can be used to raise capital in certain circumstances. So if the entity you're raising the capital, the entity you're raising capital in, that's the limited partnership or the limited liability partnership, is on lending, or it's being raised as a fund, so investment fund, then yes, it's ideal. In fact, it's preferred by a lot of investors as opposed to using a company, a limited liability company, to raise that capital. So there are certain circumstances in which it may be better to use a partnership. But generally speaking, where you're raising capital into an operating company, the preference is still to go with a limited liability company as opposed to a partnership, even though for a limited partnership and a limited liability partnership, there is some measure of limited liability. So for a limited partnership, the general partner, that's one partner, has unlimited liability, and all the other partners have limited liability. While for the limited liability partnership, all the partners have limited liability. In fact, a limited liability partnership can operate like a company to the extent that it can own land in its own name. It can sue and be sued in its own name, but it's a partnership. A limited liability partnership is a new concept, so it remains to be seen how the taxman is going to deal with such a company. I mean, it's something that we're looking to see in practice, how the taxman is going to deal with it, whether the taxman is going to treat it like a partnership, in which case tax is in the hand, it's taxes, income in the hands of the partners, or the taxman is going to say, look, this has the characteristic of an incorporation, and so I will tax you based on the Companies Income Tax Act, as opposed to the Personal Income Tax Act. It remains how that will play out in practice. So moving on to a limited liability company. Okay, we're back. So moving on to a limited liability company, liability is unlimited. You can have from one to any number of, well, if it's a public limited liability company, any number, if it's private, 50, separate personality and limited liability. In saying separate personality and limited liability, it's important to note that it's not every time that will happen. There are instances in which the veil will be lifted. So in cases of fraud, where it's clear that the board has committed fraud, gross negligence, then the court could, in those types of circumstances, say, look, I know it's a limited liability company, but I will lift the veil and I will look at the persons behind this company and I will hold them liable. So it's always important to have that at the back of your mind when you're thinking about unlimited liability for that type of company. So I'll then move to things to note in setting up a company. If you can move to the next slide. So when you're setting up a company, typically your lawyer or whoever is helping you to set it up will ask you for the name, the objects, share capital, and things like that. A few things I wanted to note about that. In terms of the name, you'll know that there are certain names that are prohibited. So if a name is offensive, it won't get registered. If a name is similar to a name that already exists, is already registered, it won't get registered. And it's always advisable in sharing a name for registration to send more than one name. If you're also using a name that you think may be similar or descriptive, then one way to ensure that you get that name is to add another word to that name that is distinctive. So just tips on registering a name. For the objects, it's important to make sure that you read your objects. Don't just say that you've told the lawyer what you want to do and the lawyer has put the objects in. I can't count the number of times we're doing due diligence on a company and the objects don't match the business of the company. Sometimes companies have expanded and they just haven't checked that expansion is in line with their objects. Sometimes companies have said, oh, this is what I want to do. This is what I intended to be my objects, but they didn't check. And so they're doing a business that they do not have the authority to be doing based on their objects. So always important to check your objects, know what your objects are, and ensure that if there's an expansion, you are amending your objects. For the share capital, that will depend on the business that you're doing, what the regulatory requirements are. I think the minimum share capital now is, I think, 1 million, but typically people would use 100,000. Sorry, no 1 million, it's now 100,000. But typically people would use, I think, 10,000 as the minimum share capital. But it depends on the industry in which you're in. You could have a minimum sectoral minimum share capital, and it's important to note that if you have foreign shareholders, you would also need a higher minimum share capital because of some of the permits that you require if you have foreign shareholders. So always useful to note. So for instance, if you're adding shareholders, you know that foreign shareholders, you know that it will have an impact on your share capital. I've put directors here as well, because we often find that people will just, okay, I'm incorporating a company, lawyer, put yourself as a director. Always important in those kinds of circumstances that you ensure that there's a nominee agreement. If somebody is just standing in for you, you said, oh, put yourself as director while I find somebody, ensure that it's recorded. And you're not just, because then once the person is registered as a director, the person is a director to all intents and purposes. So if there's an arrangement, if there are terms of the directorship, please always ensure that those terms are recorded. In fact, it's advisable to always have a director's contract or appointment letter for every director. Similar to that is subscribers. The number of issues that we've had on transactions because somebody just said, oh, take 30%, let's register this company. And then you're trying to raise and it becomes an issue. And the person says, well, I have 30%, you have to buy me out. So always make sure that a nominee shareholder is the contract reflecting a nominee shareholder as a nominee shareholder. In terms of sweat equity as well. So again, it's good to know whether your subscribers will pay up, or because shares can be unpaid in Nigeria. So it's important to know whether you want shares to be paid up or unpaid. And if shares are going to be paid up, what's the payment for those shares? Are they in cash? Are they in kind? Will it be sweat equity? And speaking of sweat equity, always just good to know that sweat needs to be documented. There needs to be a basis. We see that a lot of founders will say, oh, I'm giving myself 60%, 50% sweat equity. There has to be a backing for it. There has to be documentation. So if you know that you intend to give yourself sweat equity or give another party sweat equity, then document the sweat. And when I say document the sweat, I mean document the investment that has gone into it. If you've put in work, so for instance, you want getting a salary for the work you've put in and you want to include that as sweat, then value that work that you've put in and make sure that it's documented so that there's backing for the sweat, because sweat doesn't just come from, you can't just say with sweat equity and put a number. And also understand when you're putting in investments in terms of time, in terms of goodwill and all of that, that when you're raising capital in the future, there's a cap typically on what you can call sweat equity. So a serious investor will not come in and you tell the person you're taking 50% sweat equity. So typically you will be capped on what you can call sweat. So again, important to understand that, and sometimes take your salary, don't call it sweat, or you can defer it as opposed to calling it sweat because you might be capped in future. So, and then registered address. Your registered address doesn't have to be your business premises, right? But ensure that it's somewhere that you can access your correspondence, because a lot of the time people just put an address, maybe your mother or your father's house, or where you are currently staying, you move and you don't update your registered address. Official communication will be sent to your registered address. And so it's always important to ensure that you have access to your registered address. So moving on to the next slide, Aya, post-incorporation permits. So once you've set up your company, like I was saying, if you have foreign investors, there are certain permits you have to get. One of these is the NIPC registration certificate. So you need to apply to the National Investment and Promotion Council for a registration certificate. And that's, I think, what's the cost now? It's about 10,000, takes about 2 weeks to get. Following that, you then need to apply to the Ministry of Interior for a business permit. Now, this takes a bit longer. You have to show 100 million in terms of Naira, in terms of investment. And then that's the permit that you have to get as well because you have a foreign shareholder. If you intend to have foreign employees, you have to apply for quota approval for those positions. If you intend to, foreign employees, you also need to ensure that they are licensed. So the fact that somebody has a business visa and can come into the country or is living in the country does not mean that you can then employ that person. You have to ensure that the person has a resident permit. The immigration does do raids, and it's not nice if the immigration raids you. It's always better to ensure that you're compliant from the beginning. Certificate of capital importation. If you have a foreign shareholder that is bringing in money from offshore, ensure that you get a certificate of capital importation for those funds that are coming into the country, even if it's coming in terms of equipment, it's coming in as a loan, it's coming as equity, to the extent that you're going to make returns to that investor, whether in forms of repayment of loan or you're going to be paying dividends. Ensure that there's a certificate of capital importation, because that then allows you to repatriate the yields of that person's investment through the authorized dealer banks. So you have access to the official foreign exchange market. And there are people that will say, well, what is that worth in today's market? But it's a useful document to have. Liquidity is one thing, but the right of access is another thing. And that ensures that you have the right of access to the extent that there will be liquidity one day or the other. And then there's registration in respect of taxes. Oftentimes, because incorporation and getting your tax identification number, so registering for company's income tax, are now done almost simultaneously. A lot of people will register for that, but you find that people forget to do their VAT registration. Important to ensure that you're registered for all your taxes, and that the first tax clearance certificate is obtained within the first 6 months. So that's it on post-incorporation permits. I think I have other permits or licenses. So some of the other permits are the Special Control Unit Against Money Laundering. This is a permit that designated non-financial institutions, and there's a list of all of them, but it involves things like mechanized farming, those involved, if you have a supermarket, if you have a BDC, if you're involved in jewelry, luxury goods, and a lot of other businesses. So those kinds of businesses are required to register with the Special Control Unit at the EFCC and to make returns. So there are weekly returns that are required to be made, and you're supposed to then also register remittances or payments that you receive from clients above certain thresholds. I think for cash, the threshold is $1,000 or something maybe small like that. So important to know what your obligations are if you are one of those companies that is caught as a designated non-financial institution. There's no tap if you're going to be bringing in foreign technology. So you have a management services agreement or a technical services agreement with a foreign entity, for instance, then, or you have a trademark license agreement, you will need to register those with no tap so that you can then access the interbank market to be able to make payments. And there's also, it's a mandatory requirement, but there's no penalty per se. It's just that you will be restricted. And then there are also tax implications, actually, if you don't register with no tap. So important to note that on those remittances. Standards organization, if you're manufacturing, if you're importing, important to ensure compliance. Same thing with NAFDAC for those who have sectoral permits or licenses, Competition and Consumer Protection Commission for those, for instance, nowadays in the credit space, payment space. There's Manufacturer Association. That's not a permit, but oftentimes people in manufacturing space don't understand the value of trade associations like this. Always key to join those kinds of trade associations. I'll also speak about the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria. So for any entity that reports or regularly files returns other than with the CAC and with the FIRS, then you're required to make filings and report to the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria and comply with their laws. Now, there's a particular case, and the reason I mention is there's a particular case right now that sort of extends the scope or the interpretation of mixed filings with regulators other than the CAC and FIRS. I mean, in that particular case, one of the judges said, in this instance, they make filings with the LIRS for their employees, and so technically they are caught. So just good to have that at the back of your minds that almost every entity is now caught by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, as long as you pay payee, until that case is overturned. But even based on the law, for those who if you make filings, for instance, to NAFDAC, you will be caught. And you need to ensure compliance. And the Financial Reporting Council does do audits. They go around companies every once in a while. So good to know that. And I have pension there as well, just general. So I think we can move to, okay, before we move to taxation, maybe I can ask one question. Just to make sure people have been listening. What question will I ask now? Okay. In what instances is a sole proprietorship an appropriate vehicle to use? In what instances or circumstances is a sole proprietorship an appropriate vehicle to use? Please just type your answers in the chat box. First answer in the chat box, 5. Second answer, 3. Third answer, 1.
When to get a loan. Someone when to get a loan. When to get a loan. Okay. When you are
Who muted me? Okay, I think we have first correct answer is Anwulika. Anwulika has 5 points. Kendi has 3 points. Do we have another answer in there?
someone have said when to get loan. Is that a question? I don't know. Is there a response?
I'm not sure.
Someone wrote when starting a business. The law is for Aisha to know what to say. I think she gets 1 point as well.
How my colleagues gets what? So I can move on. Okay. But I think they've established that Monica first correct answer gets 5. So congrats, Monica. So we move on to taxation. So tax, I mean, that's the word that most business owners don't want to hear. Unfortunately, it's part of our reality. And the key aspects of compliance, so when you talk about tax compliance, there are 3 key aspects. The first is registration. So like I said, you have to ensure that you're registered for tax and you get your tax clearance certificates regularly. And then you have to ensure that you file. The period for filing taxes. So for instance, I think for tax returns generally are due by 31st March of every year. So everybody is required to have completed their tax returns by 31st of March every year. For your payee, returns are due by 31st January of every year. And then remittance. So while I'm talking about filings, I might as well talk about remittance as well. Your remittance, I think for payee is due 10th of the next month. So it's important to keep up with that. So we talked about registration in terms of compliance. Filing is the next compliance requirement for tax. So filing within the correct time and then paying your tax. Okay, so remittance comes under payments. For payee, which you have withheld, you have to remit. There's also a timeline. I think it's also within 30 days for WHT to remit WHT that you have withheld. So payment of taxes. And then going into taxes, so we have various types of taxes we have, and I'll start with personal income tax. Personal income tax is taxed at a progressive rate of between 7 to 24%. So it depends on your income, between 7 to 24%. For those 24% for those at the highest rung, and excuse me, 7% for those at the lowest rung. For those who earn minimum wage and below, they're tax exempt for personal income tax. And then payee is a form of personal income tax. It's a withheld form of personal income tax. Going to companies' income tax, again, that's a range of taxed at a rate of between 0 and 30%. For small companies, their tax rate is 0%. Small companies are companies that have a turnover, gross turnover below 25 million naira. Medium companies, they have a tax rate, effective tax rate of most medium companies, 20%. And that's between 25 million and 100 million gross turnover. And then for those with 100 million and above gross turnover, their tax rate is 30%. So again, it's graduated scale depending on turnover of the company. Now, there's also something called minimum tax. There's the minimum tax rate of 0.5% of gross turnover. So it's payable where for companies that have no taxable profit. So by the time you deduct all your expenses, there's no more profit left to tax. You will still be taxed at a minimum tax, except you're one of the tax exempt persons, like a small company. It's also payable where your tax is below minimum tax. So for instance, so whichever way, the minimum tax you will pay is minimum tax. So for instance, if you've done all your deductions, you have taxable profit. By the time you calculate your taxable profit at the tax rate applicable to you, your tax is below the minimum tax that would have been payable if it was calculated at 0.5%. Then what you will pay is the minimum tax instead of that tax computed on your taxable profit. So minimum tax is payable whether you make profit or not, unfortunately, except you are tax exempt. And so who are those tax exempt? Like I said, the small companies, agri businesses also have some form of tax exemption, and companies, you can go back to that, they're still on the slide. So companies in the first 4 years of business also have tax exemptions from minimum tax. Other types of taxes that will be paid, and just to speak quickly before I move to other taxes, deductibles. So there are certain things called deductibles, expenses. So expenses that you necessarily and wholly incur in relation to making your income are deductible expenses. You can deduct contributions that you make, like ITF, NSITF, insurance premiums, those are deductible. Interest on loans are deductible, and there are quite a few other things that will be deductible as well. And so when your accountant or the auditors are doing that, it will be clear. Those things will be clear. Your accountant, rather, when they are doing your accounts, what is deductible or not. But also useful to know, so that when you're spending, you know that, okay, there are some things that I can take out before tax, and there are some things that I can't take out before tax, and that helps you to manage your finances. Other taxes. So even though we say highest tax rate is 30%, it's not really 30%, because you will still pay education tax of 3%. That's for companies 100 million and above. And there's still value added tax of 7.5%. The stamp duties, which comes to different rates depending on the document that you're stamping. So there are rates per different types of documents. And then there is capital gains tax. Now, capital gains tax is paid when you sell an asset and you make a gain on that asset, and it's 10%. It's not applicable where the income that you, or the gain that you make on that asset is then reinvested into another asset within 12 months. Also, capital gains tax is now applicable to sale of shares. So if you sell shares in one company, then you'll pay capital gains tax on that. But if you invest the money that you got from selling your shares in one company into another company, so for instance, you had shares in, company doing well, you invested in a startup, they're now doing well, you invested in Flutterwave, they're doing very well, you've cashed out, you now want to use that money to invest in your own business. It will not be subject to capital gains tax, provided that you invest that money within 12 months, in 12 months period. Also, if the gain is less than 100 million, then it will not be subject to capital gains tax. That's in respect of shares. And there are some other exceptions as well that you can look at. What else do I want to say about taxation before I move on? For those in the free trade zone, just to note that, because we're finding that more and more companies are beginning to take advantage of the free zones. For those in the free zones, VAT does not apply, and there are many other incentives. And then, of course, we know that VAT will not apply to medical services, basic food items, and such other products. Other taxes that it may be useful to be aware of: customs and import duties, and good to fix this into your business plan if you know that there'll be customs and import duties. There are excise duties if your business involves sweetened fruit juices, tobacco products, alcohol. There'll be excise duties that you need to factor into your financial model. There's also police fund, which is, I think, 0.005% of net profit. Yeah, 0.005% of net profit. That's something else that goes out. There's an IT levy that is applicable to certain types of companies in payment space, insurance, ISPOs, those in communication. They have to pay an IT levy as well if their turnover is above 100 million. And then there's, another thing to note, so that's just other extra levies and taxes important. Another thing to note in relation to capital gains tax, sorry to take you back, is for payouts. And again, this is I do know that some people will be working while you start up your business, and the intention oftentimes is to then, when you're about to move in fully into the business, is to take part of that payout, your termination payouts or your exit payouts, and put that into the business. Capital gains tax is actually also payable on exit payouts above 10 million. So any excess above 10 million naira for an exit payout is taxable at 10%. So useful to factor that into those permutations, because we've had that come up a couple of times that people say, oh, this is what I want to use it for. But good to know that it will be taxed. So moving on, if you can help me shift slides. Okay, we're talking about other contributions. So these are things that you contribute on behalf of employees. There's the pension, 10% from the employer. And please don't be tempted not to remit pension. That too often, the times we've done due diligence, pension is always an issue. It so often comes up. And then you have the penalties to factor in, because even though penalties have not been assessed, sometimes when you're raising capital, the investor is going to, factor in possible contingent liabilities, so possible liabilities, and part of that will be liabilities for not remitting pension when you were supposed to remit it, and it does build up. So it's always good, useful to have a pension accrual fund so that you're putting away money for pension and you're remitting your pension at the time. And if you already have backlog of pension, free financial advice, have a fund for it so that there's a portion of your income every month that goes into that pot, so that you can deal with the backlog. We have now, and this is based on what is currently going on, and I don't know if any companies here would have experienced it, but there's now focus on persons who are not, remitting pensions. In fact, going back, we've had companies that have come to say that they've been investigated as far back as 15 years in terms of pension for staff that have gone donkey years ago. Industrial Training Fund, the House of Reps Committee is going at it, inviting companies on a daily basis to come and explain why they haven't made their remittances for industrial training funds and slamming penalties. Same with National Housing Fund. For the National Housing Fund is no longer mandatory, but we're having people being investigated for not complying when it was mandatory. So even though there's no investigation now, it's possible that you can be investigated many years, and this might be the time when you then want to raise capital, and then it becomes an issue with you being able to raise capital because there's an investigation ongoing at the House of Reps Committee for non-payment of ITF for the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years. So always useful to ensure compliance with all of this. So I won't go into all of this. Many of us are aware of them, and it's in the slides, what the requirements are in relation to payment. Okay, and then I'll talk about investment incentives. So the good part, there's pioneer status. Pioneer status is available. It's a 5-year tax holiday, 3 years plus 2 years, for industries that are, well, how did we put it now?
Yeah, pioneer industry.
Exactly, pioneer industries. So industries that are innovative. I mean, because of the list of pioneer industries, I don't know whether to say that they are innovative per se, but in specific industries on that list. So for instance, find industries like energy, renewable energy. So you should talk in my training. So things like, yes, as Ayo has so helpfully pointed out, things like metals, agri, communication, construction, metals, aluminium, those are on the pioneer list. So if you look at the pioneer list, it's always useful to go and look at this list and see if what you're doing actually is eligible for that 5-year tax holiday. Then there's a tax relief for research and development. I think that's tax relief for research and development is a 20% concession. So if you're doing something that involves research and development locally, you can take advantage of that tax relief. Investments in economically disadvantaged local government areas, also eligible for a tax relief of 20%. There's the Startup Act exemptions, where startups are exempt from paying companies income tax for up to 5 years, but you have to have been certified as a startup. That process hasn't fully commenced yet. That's the process for certifying or labeling a startup as a startup. But once it commences and a company has that startup status, you're eligible to 5 years tax holiday. There are exemptions for ITF contribution, that's also for startups. There's a CGT relief for investment in startups as well. So if a company invests, if an entity invests or a person invests in an entity or a company that is labeled a startup, then when the investment is sold, that investment will be exempt from capital gains tax, provided that the investor has held it for 2 years. Now, that's something that you can use it's an advantage to say, come and invest in me for when that process starts. So if you're eligible as a startup and you register as a startup, that's a way to also attract investments, to say to your investors, look, if you come and you invest in me, you hold for this period, then you get a tax relief for investing in me. So that's one to note. Also, import duty exemptions for certain categories of products, sectoral incentives for those investing in agri, who have companies in agri, manufacturing, export, renewable energy. There are quite a few sectoral incentives, so always useful to find out what those incentives are. If you go to the NIPC website, some of them are there. And you could also speak to your lawyer, speak to your financial advisors, ask specifically what are the incentives that I can get. If you have a lawyer and retainer, give them work. Tell them to go and, even the ones they haven't told you, tell them to go and look for any other available one and give you a compendium of incentives that may apply to you, because that's also a way of saving money and helping to grow your business. It's only not just about raising capital into the business, it's also about ensuring that capital is not, expenses are not flowing out of the business as well. So useful to note in terms of incentives. I think we can move on to the next one. Okay. Should we have another question session before we move on to the next one? Shall we? Okay. No?
All the cats said yes.
We are going to have another one. Okay, this one is easy. Mention 3 tax incentives. Mention 3 tax incentives.
One Ulika said private status, CGT relief and startup act. So it doesn't mean
Now, Ulika, I want to collect this my free something. Sure, people will not block Ulika's internet like this.
Does anyone have any other?
You win. You win. Do you have any other answers? So moving on to the next question.
Okay, Rashida said exports incentives. Shemus Shangule said import duty exemptions.
But those are 1. I said 3.
You can give them 1 point each.
Okay, 1 for efforts. I put 1 for them.
Yes.
1 for Rashidat and 1 for Shil.
Kofo said she contributed.
Oh yeah, I give Kofo 1.
Kende said new startup at agriculture and export incentives. So let me give her 1 as well, Kende. I think that's good for them.
Okay, so bonus question. Who is liable to pay minimum tax? In what circumstances will minimum tax be applicable? In what circumstances will minimum tax be applicable?
Companies earning between 25 to 100 million. That was source answer.
That's not correct.
That's
So
wrong. Oluwa Bimishorika said small companies. Then
No.
Shehu Shoguleye said when there is no profit. So Shehu doesn't have point. Kofo said a low salary and I don't know if that applies. No. Rhoda Jonah said no profit, no loss. Someone said Rashidat said yeah? Okay. Miriam Adela said when you receive less than minimum wage.
When you receive less than minimum wage, you're actually exempt from tax. Just
So
to be clear.
I think we need to stress that minimum tax is for companies.
Mhm.
So
So when you receive less than minimum wage, you're exempt from personal income tax. Minimum tax applies to companies, and minimum tax applies when, okay, so my question time is over, so I'm answering the question. Minimum tax applies when there is no taxable profit. So when you have taken your income, that's your revenue, gross revenue, by the time you deduct all expenses, you're even at a loss. In that circumstance, the taxman will not say, well, that one is your problem. Oh. My own tax is 0.5%. You will now be owing me 0.5% because you have to pay a minimum tax.
so then, if you will mention that, can we just explain that minimum tax concept?
Okay, so that's what I'm explaining. So minimum tax applies when the taxman has looked at you and said, after this one has removed expenses from this, their gross revenue, there's no more profit to tax, but I must tax something. So in that circumstance, minimum tax, so there'll be a deemed tax, which is minimum tax, and it's taxed at 0.5% of your revenue. And then there is also in terms of when you look at, sometimes you have a taxable profit, but your taxable profit is small. Perhaps your tax rate is also low. So your tax rate maybe is 20%, your taxable profit is small. And when the taxman looks at it, the taxman is like, when you assess this thing at 20%, and I compare it to assessing minimum tax is higher. You will pay the minimum tax. You won't pay what is your actual tax. So it's just to ensure that every business, rather not everybody, every business is paying some form of tax if you are not tax exempt. Now we said those exempt from minimum tax are those who have been in business for 4 years or less. So if you have been in business for 4 years or less and you're not making profit, you won't pay minimum tax. If you are in the agri sector, the exemptions from minimum tax, specific exemptions for those in agri. If you are a small company, so your turnover is less than 25 million, the taxman will be like, you know what, still be growing your wings and they will not tax you. But if your turnover is more than 25 million and you don't have profits, taxman is like, that one is your problem, you will pay me minimum tax. Do we understand now?
So can I ask a clarifying question?
Okay.
If you are in your first 4 years, or like let's say your first few months, but you've hit that kind of 25 million turnover, do you still have to pay tax? Does the 4-year sort of grace period apply, or are you eligible for tax?
So you are eligible to pay tax except you have an exemption. So if you are under 4 years and you have taxable profit, so you hit turnover of 25 million and you have profit. So you could hit turnover of 25 million and above and not have profit. If you hit 25 million and above, but your expenses are more than your turnover, so you don't have profit and you're under 5 years, you won't pay minimum tax. Now, if you hit 25 million and you have profit, so when your expenses, there's something to tax, right? Then you'll be eligible to tax. You'll be taxed at your whatever rate is applicable to you. But you could also be eligible for other exemptions. So for instance, if you have pioneer status exemption, even if you have taxable profit, you will not be taxed. If you have that 5-year exemption under the Startup Act, even if you have taxable profit and you're under 4 years, you will not be taxed. So it's different levels. One is, do you have profit? Second is, even if you have profit, do you have an exemption? All right, thanks, Amrika. See you get it. So moving on to governance and compliance. Just a few things to note in terms of compliance issues. How many minutes do I have left? I just have about 30 minutes. I'm going to move very quickly so that people can ask questions. Governance and compliance. Publication of name and letterhead is something that a lot of people are not aware of. Your business premises should have your name on it. It's actually a requirement under CAMA. You can be penalized for it. Similarly, your letterhead should not just have the name of the company. It should have the registered address of the company, and it should have the RC number of the company. We also often see a lot of times people have letterheads that have old directors. So you are still using your old letterhead. That could be taken as representing to whoever you send that letter that that person is your director. And if the person deals with the person as the director, then the person will be held as to having, the right to deal with that person because of the representation you have represented that this person is your director by giving out official documentation, letterhead that shows this person as your director. So always update. I know we may have printed hundreds of copies and somebody is no longer your director. Please just leave those copies and use an updated one. And thankfully now we have virtual letterheads. So please always remember to update your letterheads when you change your directors, if you have your directors' names on your letterheads. Also speaking about keeping of statutory books, you have register of members, register of directors interests, register of debentures. Those are statutory books that are required to be kept by a company. Now, many times companies don't keep these books. And because there's no stringent enforcement, it's something that people get away with. But the truth is there's actually a daily default penalty for not keeping a number of the statutory books. For a private limited company, that's 500 naira per officer per day. An officer is company secretary, directors, shareholders. So if there are a total of 10 officers in the company, that's 500 naira times 10 per day of default. And that can come up to quite a lot. And a lot of the time when you're doing due diligence, you then have to be, somebody comes, wants to invest, and their lawyer says, oh, they have no statutory books, and this is the contingent liability. You then have to get your lawyer to be writing an opinion to show why the contingent liability is not going to crystallize, etc. Or that's the point where you're now running around trying to create your statutory books. It doesn't cost anything to do it. You can have virtual statutory books, although I always advise that you have physical statutory books. They sell those ledgers and they're quite cheap. And then just update them and ensure that you're compliant. It doesn't cost anything to do it. And it can ensure that you don't get into trouble. And the truth is, there's no saying when the regulator will start to enforce. And the day the regulator wakes up to enforce, it will backdate. So that enforcement will start from whenever it is that liability started or you aren't compliant. And being a daily default penalty, that could be quite huge. Statutory filings, again, be compliant, up to date with your statutory filings. Annual returns, for instance, if you don't file them, you can't file any other thing. And then your company is listed as inactive. And we're finding more and more that people are complaining, companies will come and complain that MD visa was denied because they said the company is inactive, meaning that the company does not exist. So how can the person see that this company is paying them a salary, So, and that's become so rampant. So please keep up with your filings, and ensure that, you're up to date. When a change is made, if it's required to be filed, file it at the CC. We have general meetings, board meetings. First board meeting is required to be held within 6 months of a company being registered, and then you're required to have good corporate governance says have your board meeting.
Let me ask
Good corporate governance requires you to have your board meetings at least 4 times a year, every quarter. CAMA does not mandate it for private unregulated companies, but it's useful to ensure that you have those meetings and document them. Let there be minutes. The minutes don't have to be anything fancy, but let there be a record of the minutes of the meetings and those that signed and kept properly. AGM, you're required to have an AGM within 18 months of registering the company, and you shouldn't have more than 15 months between 2 AGMs. In order to have your AGM, your audited accounts need to be ready. So part of that is ensuring that in terms of timing, in terms of planning, your audit planning and all of that, you have your audit planning on time. If you don't plan properly, we know that auditors are usually swamped particularly year end, because they're doing banks and all of that. And then you get delayed, your audit gets bumped down. And so you then have issues with getting ready in time to file, to complete and then do your AGM and file your annual returns. Of course, if you don't have your AGM, you can't file your annual returns. If you don't file your annual returns, your company is inactive. So useful to know all of these things from a compliance perspective. Pre-incorporation contracts. Before a company is incorporated, money is spent, decisions are made. People will enter into contracts. So that's the sponsors or the founders will enter into certain contracts on behalf of the company. It's always good once the company starts to, excuse me. Thank you. It's always good when your company starts to, I think you're up next, maybe sorry, excuse me, apologies for that. Always good when your company starts to then ratify those contracts so that the company adopts them as its own contracts, just to ensure that that's on record from a formal perspective. I'll then speak about also risk management and internal controls. I know for smaller companies, the issue is, you can't spend money hiring a risk manager if it's not a mandatory requirement, or an internal auditor if it's not a mandatory requirement. But it's good to have some level of risk management and internal control, even if you're not hiring those. Sorry, 1 minute, please. Okay. Good to have that level. And one way of doing this, and we've had clients come up to us and do that, where we say, look, I'm starting this business. Can you give me a list, just give me a memo that highlights all the regulators that will apply to my business, highlight all the filing requirements, all the compliance requirements. It's a one-off fee, but it's a one-off fee that could save you a lot of money going down the line. So if you have that kind of matrix for those kind of smaller companies, you're not, because you don't want to spend money on an internal auditor, a compliance officer. You have that kind of matrix that you've gotten a lawyer to do for you, and then you then follow it. So you're taking your box. You know that the matrix says that within so and so days you have to file this, and you make sure that you file. You know that the matrix says that corporate governance requirements require you to change your external auditor after so and so years. You have that in front of you, and you can use it as a roadmap. That's one way of managing this until the company then grows. So just a tip on how to ensure that from a risk management perspective, you're good.
Someone asked if we can help them with all these tax processes, but the information is overwhelming.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yeah. We
can. Yes, I know it can be a lot. So moving on, so intellectual property. I will hand over to my colleague now, Ada. I know intellectual property, but I'm not an expert. Ada is an expert, a guru in intellectual property, media and entertainment law. So I know people are tired of even hearing my voice now. Ada will now take the intellectual property section, and then I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I don't know that I can.
Okay, let me switch off my speaker.
I hope I can follow this act. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Please,
Good afternoon.
confirm that you can hear me. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. My name is Ada Agocha. So I'm a member of the IP team. I'm by no means an expert, still learning, but I'm happy to be here with you guys and to share my little knowledge on IP. So I just want to say that there are several types of IP. And if you look at the slide that we have on, and we've listed 5 of them: copyrights, trademarks, patents, industrial designs, and trade secrets. For the purpose of this training and for constraints of time, we will focus on the main 3, which are the most common and probably the IP that you have encountered in your business. And that will be trademark, copyright, and patents. So first, I'll just start by talking about what is IP. IP, we describe it as a creation of the mind. It's an intangible asset. It's not something, it's usually something that we refer to it as intangible because you cannot, it's more or less not something that you can hold on to, but it's a creation of the mind that has been realized in some physical form. For example, a trademark. The most popular one, like the bottle of water I have before me, Nestle. That's the brand name. I'm Pure Life. I don't know if my camera is clear enough to see, but that is a trademark, right? So that's the most common thing I can lay my hands on to describe what IP represents, the most common form of IP that we encounter in our daily lives. So moving on to the next slide, please, Aya. Okay, so let's first of all talk about trademark. What is a trademark? A trademark is any word, phrase, or design that distinguishes one source of goods from another. So I'll use my bottle of water again. The Nestle brand distinguishes Nestle from Eva, from Aquadana, or any other water. That's a trademark. Now, what makes a trademark? What are the most important things to note about a trademark? Because it's one thing to develop a trademark and use it in relation to your product. It's another thing to ensure that you can exploit your trademark without interference from anybody. And what is important to note for this is the elements of a trademark, what makes a trademark protectable, right? So the first thing to note is that a trademark must be distinctive. When we say a trademark is distinctive, it means that it is capable of distinguishing your product from another person's product. And please don't mind my use of the word product. We can also use trademarks to identify services, right? So product here will refer to both goods and services in the way that I use the word. So what makes a trademark distinctive is that you're able to distinguish one product from another because of the trademark that is applied to it. So for example, the Nestle brand, you see that, say, oh, that's Nestle. And you see Eva, and you say, oh, that's Eva. And so that is what makes it distinctive. We'll talk a little later about what makes a trademark distinctive, right? Those elements of it that make it distinctive. But I also want to also refer, if you look at the slide, I say a trademark must be distinctive and not descriptive. So what descriptive here means is you cannot register cup and call it a cup. You cannot design a cup, for example, and name it cup. That is not allowed because it is describing the product itself. So just to bear in mind that when developing your brand, developing a trademark, you should bear in mind there are some things that you may use it, but you may not be able to protect it or gain exclusive use of it. I hope I'm not using too much technical terms and making anything confusing, but just please indicate so I can take it again if I'm not being clear. And the second element to note about a trademark is that it should not be deceptive or likely to cause confusion with an existing trademark. This is an area that is, in our practice, we find a lot of people coming to us to say, oh, somebody has said, I am using a mark that is similar to theirs, or that, that your trademark is, confusingly similar to other people's. What this means is that one's trademark must be different. The elements of it must be such that you cannot confuse it with someone else's trademark, or that a purchaser who goes to the market is not confused as to, is this product, does it belong to manufacturer A or manufacturer B? And so that element of, I would use the word again, distinctiveness is very important. Now I will talk about what the elements of a trademark should be or what is permitted in the law. You can use your name as part of your trademark. You can use your company name as part of your trademark. And you can add any element that makes it distinctive. For example, what most people would do is to design a logo. Now that is one way of, creating a very distinctive element. Although there are circumstances where two logos may be similar, it might be necessary or important to engage the services of expert graphic designers to come up with something distinctive and and different. But when we talk about copyrights, we'll also talk about how when engaging experts is also necessary to protect yourself by entering into the necessary contracts so that you have the rights of those products created by your visual designer or visual graphic designer. And then thirdly, a trademark should not be contrary to morality or public policy. That is one of I'm sure in your interaction with Nigeria and Nigerian laws, you would have come across this particular provision in many laws. And how it is more or less the government, the courts have sort of discretionary power in describing or interpreting what is contrary to morality or public policy. But I think for businesses, it's better to be safe than to be sorry. For example, if one wants to register a trademark spelled FCUK, it is not the swear word that we know, but looking at it, it brings to mind that swear word. The pronunciation is probably similar. One can make the argument that, oh, it's not the same thing, therefore it should fly, but you probably will have challenges getting registration for that trademark or using it without, being harassed by the government. So it's best not to go there. So those are issues, those are points to bear in mind when developing your brand, when seeking registration for your brand. Another thing to note is if you apply to register your trademark with the trademark registry, you have a period of 7 years for the first registration. And then subsequent, you are required to renew for a period of 14 years at every 14-year interval unto perpetuity. For as long as you renew the trademark, you can continue to exercise rights over the trademark. I should also mention that trademark rights are of two elements, or two aspects, I should say. First, there's registration. Some people would develop a trademark and then obtain registration. Some people would develop a trademark and just use it without obtaining registration. Now, it is advisable to always get your registration, but even in those circumstances where you have used a trademark and failed to register, as long as you can demonstrate goodwill that you have developed from the use of that trademark consistently over years, you are entitled to some rights as of the use of that trademark, right? But it's, as lawyers would always advise, best to get a registration. It's easier to prove your ownership of that trademark via a registered certificate. So moving on to the next slide, please. Aya, next slide. And so the next one, we'll talk about copyright. Now, the copyright regime in Nigeria protects different types of works. One of it is literary works, another is musical work, artistic work, audiovisual works, sound recording, and broadcasts. We will not go into detail on that, but the most important thing to note about copyright is unlike trademark registration, there is no requirement for registration with any government agency, right? A copyright is created from the moment it is put down in a tangible form. So if someone conceives of a piece of music in their head and then they reduce it to a recording, that piece of recording is copyright protected. So from the moment that recording from the moment that music is put in a recorded form, a copyright is created from that moment. There's no need for registration. So what copyright does is that it protects ideas expressed in a tangible form. But this work, for a copyright to be protected, it must be original. And like I said, must be fixed in a tangible form that can be perceived or communicated. What other points to note on copyright is that, yes, it automatically vests in the creator of a work that qualifies as a copyright. But there is also a creator of a work can assign that right to another person. I earlier referenced engaging, for example, a visual designer to create a logo, for example, for a business. Now, a logo that would be a visual created by a visual graphics designer would qualify as a copyright. Now, in this circumstance where a business would engage an independent contractor, what is very important to do is to have the copyright in that work assigned to the business or assigned to the owner of that business, right? So that you can exercise all control over the logo that you've created. So these are very important points to note. I should also point out that there is a system, there is a regime for registration. Like I said, registration is not required because in and of itself, it does not confer any right. It is the creation of a work and recording it in a tangible form that creates a copyright. So moving on to the next slide now on patent. Now, a patent is slightly, or I should say very different from a copyright, because it is a process. A patent can arise under two, I think, right, okay, right. So a patent can arise under two circumstances, where a person creates something, a new invention, or develops a process for doing something. And it could also be an improvement on an existing state of art. For example, someone designs a travel mug that can retain heat, can retain a heated liquid for a long period of time. And someone comes up with a process to develop an even a travel mug that can hold heated liquid for an even longer period, say for 48 hours, and comes up with a process for doing that. That additional process is also, there's also patent protection available to the creator of that new process. So the important thing to note here is that there are two, patent can be created there are two ways to create a patent. One is by inventing a new product. Another one is a process for creating a product. Now, I just want to give the rationale for patents here is that on the one hand, the government gives you the right to exploit your invention for a period of time exclusively. And in exchange for that exclusivity, you must reveal the process by which you created this invention, so that you are contributing to the development of the state of the art regarding that specific theme. And so it's more like a quid pro quo between inventors and the government for the benefit of the general public. So this system has resulted in a lot of development in our world, for example, pharmaceuticals and everyday products that we use. So what is important to note is what makes an invention patentable, because you might develop something and it's not patentable. There are three things to note that makes a product or an invention patentable. And one of them that it is new. I've recently spoken about this, that it is new in the state of the art. There is nothing like it that exists. New here would also refer to a development on something that exists. So it must not be entirely new, but you can develop something new on an existing state of the art. You can extend or you can improve on something that exists, and that would qualify under the requirement for newness. And then secondly, it must result from an inventive activity. And that's one of the things that are required when we speak about filing of a patent registration, is that you're required to present statement of claim to the registry. And that statement of claim would demonstrate how you came about this invention. So the inventive activity is more or less to state how you came about this invention and how it was created. And thirdly, it must be capable of industrial application. Capable of industrial application means that a person can pick up the process by which you invented this product or the process that you have described and apply it in the same way and end up with the same result. And that is what capable of industrial application means. And then another thing to note about the patent is that once you obtain registration with the patent registry, it has a lifespan of 20 years. And it is renewable every year. And after the 20-year elapses, the patent you cease to have exclusivity over it, and it's open to the public, who can then exploit it. Now, the difference between this and a trademark is that a trademark is in perpetuity for as long as you continue to renew it every 14 years after the initial 7 years. It continues in perpetuity for as long as it is renewed. Copyright, depending on the jurisdiction and the nationality of the copyright owner, and the nationality of the copyright owner, has a lifespan of something like 70 years or 50 years after the death of the author. And then for patent, which is the shortest that we're talking about today, is for a period of 20 years, renewable annually, after which it's open to the public for exploitation. I think that is the conclusion for our IP section. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to take it after the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We really appreciate. Thank you. And Miss Hayodele.
I have 7 minutes. I'm going to rush through, but I'm still going to use 1 minute of that to ask question.
That's a good one.
Fastest finger. 1 minute to answer. A trademark must not be dash. A trademark must not be what? And I said 3 things that a trademark must not be, or it must be.
Give us one.
First person to give us one.
Descriptive.
Without effect, the laptop that said that.
I think that was blessing.
So I think both of them said at the same time. Yeah.
Okay.
Effect the laptop and blessing.
Okay, we'll give 2 of them. Okay.
And then how will you cut 3 points? No, for 4, 3 points. No, Femi,
Real bonus.
I want better resources.
Everybody that answered within that cutoff period, 1 minute, 3 points. We'll divide it. So moving on, handling contracts. Oh, my video is not on. Sorry. Handling contracts. So we all know what a contract is. Just wanted to point out a few things, issues that we typically see with contracts. First is that ensure your contract is in writing. Yes, an oral contract is valid, but it is harder to prove. So please try and make sure as much as possible that contracts are reduced into writing. Even handwritten, 1 page, better than nothing. Always read through your contract, even if your lawyer has read it. You find that you say, oh, that's not what I wanted to say. Please read through your contract and know what your contract is saying. Confirm that the essential items are contained in your contract. What is the purpose of the thing that you are doing? Confirm that it's there. Your lawyer might not understand the substance of your business, even if you say, oh, your lawyer has read it, your mentor has read it. Your mentor or your lawyer may not understand the substance of your business. So always confirm. And it's so often we see this that people don't read their contracts. In fact, sometimes you will send a contract to a client, and this is even big companies, and they'll send it with comments. You have questions to them saying, oh, confirm this. They'll just forward it to the other party to sign, even with comments where you ask them to confirm certain issues. So please always read your contract. Ensure that it clearly describes your obligations. What is it that you are giving this person? Make sure the contract is specific about your obligation so that there's no confusion tomorrow as to what you have committed to do or not to do. Ensure that it is duly executed. It seems like that's an obvious one, but the number of contracts that we have seen when there is an issue that are not signed, it begs belief. Ensure that it's executed and that it's executed by the right person. And this is where having a lawyer comes in. So you are selling land and the CEO of the company, who is not even a director, signs the deed of assignment by himself. It's an invalid contract, right? Because that kind of contract is required to be executed as a deed by 2 directors, or director and secretary. So ensure the right person is signing and ensure that your contract is fully signed. Not that you agree and then everybody forgets about signing. Understand the dispute resolution framework. So whatever is in there, understand it. Understand how many days you need to do mediation for. Understand. So those kind of, whether it's arbitration, whether it's litigation, those kind of things help you to be strategic, when there's a dispute. It's not when things are fully spoiled that you now start checking, and we have gone to court, so it's supposed to be arbitration. No. So at the beginning, you fully understand what your rights and your remedies are. And part of that is understanding your dispute resolution framework. Read it. If you don't understand it and you have a lawyer, tell your lawyer to explain it to you. That's why you're paying the person. Explain my contract to me. Explain what this term means, right? Understand the applicable regulations so that you avoid having an illegal or a void contract. If there's a statute that says that an approval or something is required for this contract can be valid and you don't get it, then your contract is invalid. All you have is a piece of paper. So important to always understand the applicable regulations around whatever you're contracting. There are some regulations that say a person cannot provide a service without a particular type of license. Now, your contract doesn't contemplate that license and you say that you have a contract. It's an illegal contract and you can't enforce an illegality. So always important to understand that. And like I said, seek legal counsel, have a lawyer. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a lawyer and I want to work, but it's good to always ensure. And, these things can be structured, right? it doesn't have to be, oh, I have an expensive lawyer on retainer. We've had people come and say, look, I can't afford a lawyer on retainer, but guess what? Can you help me do my template contracts? So that I can then know that I have a suite of template contracts that I can then get maybe a small lawyer from a junior lawyer that can just be doing contract management, because I already have very watertight template contracts. I have watertight terms, you know, terms of engagement, terms of use on my website, those kind of things. Don't play with your terms of use. Don't go and copy something from the internet. Ensure that your terms of use, if you're an online business, are adopted to you. They're for your business, and they're very clearly reviewed in line with your specific business, please. So that's it for contracts. And then moving into, we have 1 minute. I'll go over by 3 minutes, permit me. So raising capital. Well, there are two types of capital in a nutshell. There's debt and there's equity. And debt really is just capital that you're going to repay. So you're raising funds on credit, you'll repay over a period of time. Whether you do well or gata, you're going to pay back your loan. Equity, on the other hand, is, you know, an allotment of shares. And sometimes equity is not necessarily shares. Equity can be options, for instance, but that's a form of equity. So it's an ownership stake in the company in exchange for funding. Equity doesn't have to be repaid. There are instances in which equity is repayable, for instance, if it's preference shares. And that's why it's also important to understand the type of equity you're given, because preference shares have the nature of debt, even though they are equity, right? But they don't have. So for instance, and I'll speak to that when I go to equity. So it's always important to really just understand. And you get debt, you get equity, depending on your circumstances and what your needs are. And again, important to understand the nature of those so that you determine what your needs are. Debts can be loans, overdraft, all of that. Equity, like I said, can be ordinary shares, can be preference shares. Just speaking to preference shares in particular. Preference shares, typically, if you'll be given preference shares, I will beg of you, do not come, because you find that people have contracted certain things even before they come to the lawyer, and they're saying, well, this is the term sheet, you signed it. So you can't even walk out of it. If you're giving preference shares, don't be given full equitable rights like control, full board seats, all of that, because that's the whole point of them they're taking preference shares because they are de-risking. So the risk is lower because they are taking a loan type of, the risk is lower because they're kind of like taking it's almost like a loan. You're going to pay back these preference shares. They have priority as opposed to pure equity, right? So if you then give the full equitable rights and the person has de-risked themselves using preference shares, then, sorry, 1 minute, please, if I could just take, so I'll add another 1 minute to my time, sorry. So, yeah, where was I? So I was saying, yeah, about preference shares. And so make sure that your term sheets, even from the beginning, when you are saying, okay, this is what we'll give you before we start drafting the agreement, that a lawyer sees your term sheet so that they can then say, okay, well, if this is the type of funding you are getting, then these are the standard rights that should attach to that funding. Because the rights that are attached to debt are different from the rights that are attached to equity. They're different from the rights that are attached to a hybrid. And here I haven't spoken about hybrids, but they're hybrids. So for instance, a convertible loan is a hybrid. A convertible loan is both debt and equity. So it's a loan that upon certain circumstances will then convert into equity. And typically a lender will say, I want to take convertible debt because I don't want to go all in. I don't want to take the equity risk until I'm certain about certain things. I want to hedge my bets and do a loan. So the person is hedging. And so the person at that point will not have full equity rights, but the person has more equity rights than somebody who is doing pure debts and is saying, whatever you do, just pay back my money, right? So there is that to note. Convertible loans as well. A lender could take convertible loans like I said, to manage exposure on equity rights, to manage his exposure, to say, okay, you know what, it'll be convertible. I don't intend to manage the exposure on a debt. So I don't intend to convert, but I want to have some form of control. I want to have certain rights that allow me to look into your books, you know, all of that. And so I want it to be a convertible debt. So there are sometimes financiers will take convertible debt, not necessarily because they want to convert. I mean, if the triggers are met, they will convert, but not necessarily because they want to convert. They just want to manage their risk. So the types of funding can depend on risk management. You can also, as a borrower, decide that you want convertible debt. And because it's cheaper debt, so it's a form of debt, it tends to be cheaper than pure debt, because there's some form of control that the person giving convertible debt will typically have. They'll probably have a seat on your board. They'll have information rights. They'll have certain veto rights, things like that. So it does tend to be cheaper, and it's a way to ensure that, well, I want this debt. I want cheaper debt that has some form of equity. Maybe I even want some management advice from them or management involvement from them, but I don't want to dilute. And that can then be a reason why you say, look, I'll take convertible debt instead of pure debt or instead of equity. So Ayo, if you could help us move to the next slide. So quickly, just talking about equity financing. I have angel investors here. Typically, these are for really young companies, 5 to 7 years. Usually you're at the prototype stage. Successfully raising angel investment really just depends on your network of investors. If you have a good network, it's easier to raise angel investment. Then venture capital, that's early stage, where you already have a revenue model, you already have some customers, you already have a revenue strategy in place. They can see where the money is going to come from. And then you have private equity, which is growth stage. So there are more established companies, you have profit margins, you have a stable cash flow, and you're just looking for funding to grow. That's where private equity will typically come in. You also have crowdfunding platforms, and there are SEC-registered crowdfunding platforms that you can then apply to if you've had a minimum of 2 years operating track record. And then, of course, you have government grants and the like that you can use. So next slide. This just gives you a brief overview of the difference between debt and equity. Claim on cash flow, tax treatment, maturity, control, so that you just snapshot of high-level differences between debt and equity. Do we have any other slides?
Preparing for capital.
Okay, so preparing for capital raise. Because throughout this presentation, I've been talking about capital raise, or when you eventually are raising capital, or implications of different things on raising capital. So ultimately, the intention behind most businesses is to raise capital, whether internally or externally, and to grow. In raising capital, one thing that you should have at the back of your mind is that you should be clear about your value proposition. So people call it the elevator pitch. It should be ready. You should be able to speak to your value proposition, your market potential. You should have a solid business plan and your financial projections in place. Don't just start doing that when you are at that stage. Start doing it from now. And these are things that I'm just picking out from mistakes that we've seen from other small and growing businesses, which have then delayed or hindered capital raise, things they haven't done that they ought to have started doing. And make sure that you're building a strong team. It's not about the person. Oftentimes investors, because then you become a key man risk, right? So have a team if possible. And this does not necessarily mean that you have to then be paying people huge salaries. There are ways to structure ensuring that you have a team around you. Find ways to demonstrate traction and progress. So your story should show how you've grown, because they're investing in growth. They're not investing in a static company. And be due diligence ready. And due diligence ready relates to everything we've spoken about in terms of registration, in terms of compliance, in terms of tax, all of that. Due diligence ready means that if somebody, your books should be ready so that if somebody comes and says, I want to invest in you tomorrow, you can easily bring out everything and it's ready. You're not just cleaning up yourself. You're not just running up and down saying, we don't have this, we don't have that. And it's easier then to then raise capital when somebody can say, oh, you've signed the NDA and I can open up my books to you like straight away, right? So just things to note in raising capital. Should we take one question before we call it a day? And then people ask their questions.
Yeah, I've put your email. So I've sent your email into the chat.
Okay. Somebody had a hand up, I think, or something like that. I'll say, okay. Addis Agro?
Hello, good day, Ma. So thank you. This is kind of an eye-opener for me, even though some of the books are some of my books are okay, but there's something that you just said last. When investors ask for your documents about NDA, please can you talk more about it? Because sometimes when people request for your documents, internal documents, you tell them, to sign an NDA, they kind of flip, or they feel that you don't trust them. But this is purely business, and I know purely legal. This is something that we need to, an I that we need to dot. So please, can you really speak to that? Thank you.
An NDA is very important, particularly if you have a concept that can be taken. Even if you don't, I mean, you're opening up your books to somebody. I'm inviting you into my house, and I'm opening up everything for you. An investor, a serious investor, will not say they don't want to sign an NDA, and you can make it a mutual NDA. It's not necessarily one-sided. Your template NDA can be saying, I won't disclose anything about you. You won't disclose anything about me. So we are free, and it's to just tell whoever it is that is saying. So if you give somebody an NDA and the person is saying, I don't want to sign it, is to educate them and explain that, look, this is just best practice to just ensure that I'm not saying that you tell anybody what you've seen in here, but it's good to have. It shows good compliance. We're trying to build good that structure as a business, and it's just our practice to ensure that we have right documentation in place. An investor should want you to be structured, should want you to be compliant with best practice. So anybody who is then still saying, oh no, I don't want to sign an NDA, then maybe you shouldn't be opening your books to that person.
Thank
Miriam.
you very much. Thank you.
Miriam. Miriam, you have your hand up, Miriam Adiola.
Yes, good afternoon, ma.
Okay, good. Okay, is Miriam and Abibat are the same person?
No, I'm Abibat.
Oh, okay, Miriam is on. Okay, Abibat, let's take Miriam and then we'll take you. I think she had a hand up. Thanks. Okay, Miriam.
All right, ma. I wanted to ask, apart from the tax in identification number that comes with the business incorporation certificate, how do we get the tax?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
I'm certain. I know that thing comes with the business registration, business incorporation certificate. It is there already, but you mentioned tax tax registration. How do you get those two?
Oh, okay, your VAT registration and the other. Yes, you still have to go to your tax office and do your VAT registration. Then even your TIN. So you have your TIN or your certificate, but you need to go to your local tax office because sometimes there's an error with that TIN. Sometimes the local tax office doesn't have it on their records. So you need to go to your local tax office and register still, even with your TIN.
Okay, and yes, they'll also give you an additional VAT registration number and tax pro login. And those are the two numbers those are the two things you actually use to do your tax filings, not necessarily your TIN.
All right, thank you very much, ma. Thank you very much, sir. So we need to go to
Sorry, I didn't get that, but if you're asking, you need to go to your local tax office. Yes, so the one in your area, in the area where your business is registered.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, Abiba.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you very much for the lecture delivered. We appreciate it. So, sorry, my questions are in three phases. So, firstly, the first question is that on signing, you made mention of having board meetings, and you said it should be at least something quarterly. I don't know if it is monthly, quarterly, or it is yearly you mean. So, and number 2 question is that, sorry, I was out of data for some time, so I left the meeting. So I wanted to ask the speaker who spoke about intent and patent and invention or something. She talked about trademark. So I wanted to ask a question from her that's concerning that trademark. Now I understand that concept, but how is it relevant? Is there any relationship between trademark and you having CAC, like Corporate Affairs Commission, and is it that they are related, or does it mean that somebody that is already registered under CAC is also necessary for the person to go for trademark registration? So I don't know if they are interwoven or if they are different. And the third question, ma, is that okay, yes, concerning the equity financing. So I was trying to capture out some points on that slide. I don't know if you can share back the slide, or if you can, maybe you can generously give us the slide, as in to have a copy of our own. So I was trying to write out the points on that equity financing, but I could not get all the points ready. So I think that is that for now.
Yeah, we'll share the slides, not an issue. On the first point, so I said it's best practice. I mean, it's not for every company is it mandatory. There are some regulated companies that you have to have meetings quarterly or within a particular period. But general best practice, if you look at codes of corporate governance worldwide, which are not necessarily mandatory for every company, would say that you should have meetings at least quarterly, so that the board can catch up. So that, I mean, because the whole point of the board is to provide supervision to management. If the board is not meeting, how are they providing that supervision? So ideal best practices, every quarter, you should have a meeting. But like I said, it's not a mandatory requirement of law in all cases. So I'll allow Ada to answer the trademark versus CAMA question. You can just repeat.
Hi. So I'm sorry, I think I may have missed the question. Is the question regarding whether you can register a company name?
No. So if you have to share, ask that where does trademark come in when you already have your company registered at CAMA? What's the difference if you, at CAC, if your company is registered, you have a company name registered, you still need to go to, why do you need trademark?
Oh, so because it's completely different. Because first of all, the company registration is as to your company. Trademark, like I explained, is to identify your products or your services, right? So it's important. They are completely two different things. On the one hand, you want to recognize and protect your brand that you use to identify your service or your business or your product. So although it may look as though it's double registration, it really isn't, because trademark registration gives you exclusivity as to the use of your brand name in relation to products or services, right? But your company name is more or less something used to identify your business as alone. And what's important to note is that when you have trademark registration, you can prevent other people from using a mark that is similar to yours. Let me just use a name now, a name that is similar to your company name or a brand name in relation to anything else that is a product. But as for a company name, you can prevent other people from using the same name as a company name. You can also prevent them from using your company name as a trademark, because there's a provision in CAMA that says if you have a registered trademark, you can prevent other people from using your registered trademark and registering it as a company. So it more or less gives you double protection.
Okay. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, but just to know that they are two completely different things, although it might seem similar, but they are not the same.
Okay. And just to add, sometimes your trademark and your company name are not the same.
Right.
So sometimes you actually, it's not even necessarily double protection. So for instance, your company name may be A and B Investments, but you have created a brand, Atushe bags, right? In that circumstance, your trademark and your company name aren't the same, and it's then important to register both. So you don't need to register Atushe brands as a company name, but you should register it as a trademark so that people can't then use it, whether as a company name or as a mark or any other thing. I think we can take one more question from Anwolika, and maybe we call it a day. There are no other ones. Can we check in the chat if there are any questions? Anwolika, please.
Anwolika, you can go ahead.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out for a second. Thank you so much. This was really, really informative. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. This is really informative. Please bear with me because I have a few questions. So the first was about basically just wanting to learn a bit more about convertible debt, and how that could potentially work, and whether it is a good option for a family and friends fundraising round, or if it's something that is better for, like, let's say, like angel investors and things like that. The second question is, if a company is registered in Nigeria, so my company is registered in Nigeria and in the UK, and the primary sort of accounts that we use and business address is the UK, how does taxation work across multiple countries, and reporting? Because I know that I have to obviously file and things like that in the UK, but I'm not entirely sure how it works when you have a country that's operating in multiple, like, internationally as well. And then, yeah, last thing is, this is all a lot, especially as a startup. I'm a solo founder, thank God for ChatGPT. But I feel like it's quite difficult as a startup to find like legal advice. So what is your advice for, early stage startups when it comes to finding lawyers, finding financial advisors? And you gave like a really great tip around the templates, but as far as like that kind of ongoing support, is there anything in place? Let me know if you could still hear me. Is there anything in place for early stage startups to actually get that kind of support? Because it feels like it would require a lot of resources. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question. Yeah, I think I would say there are a lot of lawyers that are involved. For instance, where we're fully involved in supporting startups. We're involved in supporting Fintech Association of Nigeria. I think we got the Startup Innovator Ecosystem Award, Ecosystem Innovator Award, Lagos Innovates, all of that. So we're fully involved in that system. What I would say is, in getting a lawyer, don't be afraid to approach the firms. Don't be afraid to approach, because sometimes people say, well, these firms, they're too big, their money is plenty. Approach a lawyer. So for instance, people have walked into BNI and said, this is what I'm trying to do. How can you help me? It's not cut and dried, right? Something can always be structured. So if you need legal advice, ask. And something can be structured. If it doesn't work out, if you can't come to an agreement that works, a lot of lawyers will refer you. So you find that firms who can't even come to an agreement based on restrictions in terms of their fee structure and the level of discount they can give, know of sound practitioners that can give further discounts that they can refer you to. So just ask, will be my advice. And come to BNI. We like startups. We help startups. So to your question about family and friends and convertible debt, it could be and it couldn't be. So it depends. It depends on the terms of the convertible debt. It depends on the amount that is coming in. So if you're receiving a small amount, for instance, not a decent amount, but not too substantial from family and friends, to get the business to a particular stage, and the terms are such that the conversion is not at a rate that makes you uncompetitive or makes it uncompetitive for your angel investor or your VC to come in, then it's fine. It's good because the VC then doesn't have somebody else in the company that they are worried about you know, at that point, so at that point, it's convertible. They can decide that they, you know, buy the person out as debt, you know, different ways, as opposed to an entrenched equity that came in at a valuation that nobody can really, because valuation is always an issue. People are coming, VCs or investors are coming in and they're saying, what was the valuation at this time that this person came in? On what basis is this person holding 30%? So it could be a good way to bring in family and friends. But I would say that be careful about your terms so that when they are coming in, the value at which they are converting is not too high. Also would be good if you have provisions in there that give you the option so that you can decide not to convert. And they can be bought out by an investor as debt instead of converting. So that gives you a bit more. So I'm giving you all your free legal advice now. The third one, I would say you may need to reach out to us because we need to then understand, that's the one about multiple operations and how that impacts your tax. Ownership, exactly, the ownership structures, all of that. We will need more information and we'll then probably need to give specific advice on how you structure, because taxation and tax efficiency, a lot of the time, would depend on your business structure and how you structure your business, how you structure your ownership, how you structure the layers. So we can then advise to say, okay, this your structuring is not really tax efficient, or you may need to restructure the way you own it, or this works. You just need to ensure that you're eligible in this manner to take advantage of this incentive that is available under this type of structure. So
okay, thank you. Sorry, this is a very quick one since you kind of weaved out of the last one. Is if you receive funding from investors, like in the form of grants, or as, you know, debt or equity, whatever, is it taxable? So are grants taxable, and are is funding, like, let's say, anywhere from $100,000 more, is that taxable?
So income is what is taxable. Grants, you know, debt, those are investments. So it's income, gross revenue minus expenses. Okay, yeah. So Miko has helpfully pointed out that except secondary sales, so that's the exception. But generally, it's your income. It's your income that will be taxed, not investment. So if somebody is bringing in equity, it's capital. It's not income.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Ayodele.
Oh yes, before we end, just Ayomiko, who are those who have gotten something?
Yes, Awulika was followed by Shehu, followed by Kofo.
Okay, so Awulika has what? 13, Shehu has 6, Kofo 4. There's somebody with 3. Okay, Blessing. Okay, how do we do this? And then we have a few people with 1. Okay, Miriam has 3 as well. And then we have Aisha, Rashida.
Share the email addresses in the chat. So if you can, maybe if they can message you, we'll take it from there.
Okay, so do we give people who have 1 something? Okay, you know what? I'm going to send a
picture of the list.
Yeah, a picture of the list, but just so that can people see it? People can identify themselves. I'll send that list. All those who have 1. So Aishat, Rashidat, Kendi, Helen, Ife, what's this? Ife Dolapo. Is that Ife Dolapo? Yeah. Does Femi have 1?
Femi have 1.
What's his name?
Sumaya.
Sumaya. So those people, you get 10%. If you come to BNI, whatever service it is that you come to BNI for, you get 10% off. Aisha, Rashidat, KD, Helen, Ife Dolapo, Femi, and Sumaya. 10% off. The next set, Blessing, who has 3, Miriam, who has 3. You have 15 or 20.
20%.
20% off for Miriam and Blessing. Whatever service you come to BNI for, you get 20% off. Then for No, Amulika gets free service because she's at the top. Free service. Remember my caveat at the beginning, no, not every free service. Then Sheung and Kofo at 6 and 4. What do we give Sheung and Kofo? 25%.
This is 90%.
So Sheung and Kofo 25% off. I think I've tried. Everybody got something. So you can reach out to us via email. I'll also send the list of names to Paradise at the Nest.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. And everybody that got the I'm not going to say free, the discounted legal advices. Congratulations to every one of you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Ayodele. We really appreciate you. But before you leave us, please, we would like to take a picture with you. So everybody, kindly put on your camera and let's take a picture with Mrs. Ayodele. Kindly put on your camera. And thank you, Mr. Ayo. And Mr. Ada, thank you as well. We appreciate that. Kindly put on your camera and let's take a picture with Mrs. Ayodele. Please put on your cameras. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, and thank you. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ms. Abba. Thank you, Mr. Ayo, and thank you, Mr. Ayodele. We appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening and for participating. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. So to every other person, I have dropped the link to the attendance form in the chat box. Please ensure you fill that form before you exit from today's session. And okay. So today is our last, yes, our last virtual class. We'll be having a physical class on Thursday, and I'll be expecting to see your beautiful faces again. Do have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.